So yeah, what a great title I was given, Sangharakshita, the Great Translator. Yeah, it's a good title and a good way to address Sangharakshita. But yeah, I'll go back to Jai Gupta's introduction. I moved here with Windhorse Publications, which was my day job for something like 25, 27 years. And we came to Sheffield to establish a small community of about 5 of us, which would be dedicated to the work of Windhorse Publications. We moved in December 1988, just in time for me to actually leave the country. So I'd more or less unpacked, and then I jumped on a plane to California and then on to New Zealand for the first of something like 15 visits to New Zealand as a president and preceptor. My very last visit coincided with the beginning of the lockdown. So when I flew home thinking, yippee, no more long-haul flights for me, I felt a bit special. It was like my moment at the end of that era in my life. And the whole bloody world did it. And sort of, I felt they were raining on my parade. It was my drama, not theirs. But anyway, be that as it may. When I arrived in New Zealand, 1989, it was the beginning of an interesting era in the history of the country. There'd been a treaty made between the Pakeha, the white colonial immigrants, and the native New Zealanders, well, the Maori, who were native at least from about 1066, that sort of period. And because it was quite recent, the settlement in New Zealand, they did something fairly unprecedented quite early on in the story. They made a treaty or an agreement between like the white colonial immigrants and the Maori population called the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, the problem, when I arrived in 1990, it was the beginning of a almost 10, 20, 30-year period of extended court cases and demonstrations where the problems generated by that treaty had to be finally worked through. It was a great thing that there was an attempt at a treaty, but the problem with the treaty was it was written in English and then translated overnight into Maori by a missionary, I think a British missionary and his son. In one night, they attempted a Maori translation. And one of the core problems with the treaty was that the English version had the word sovereignty, Her Majesty's sovereignty over this country. There was no word for sovereignty in Maori because the idea of owning a country was just not part of their understanding of life, of the universe, anything. So the word that was used was, in the Maori translation, was government. So right from the outset of this treaty, there was this glitch, this misunderstanding between the idea of what was going on, which, as I say, led to something like 30 years of court cases and issues, which are kind of more or less ironed out in quite a mature way now. But it really did prove, or it really does prove, that dispute that arose over that translation, how much words matter, how much translations matter, that translation isn't just a science. You can't always find an equivalent word, and sometimes if you think you have, it isn't really the right word because there is so much more to the words that we use than we perhaps realize. Just literally, as I was preparing this a couple of days ago, I was reading The Economist, and there's an article by Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli public thinker, if you like. And there's a little paragraph in his article which, anyone who's read him knows that stories are a big part of his argument. But he wrote in this paragraph, language is the stuff of almost all human culture. Language is the stuff almost all human culture is made of. Human rights, for example, aren't inscribed in our DNA. Rather, they are cultural artifacts we created by telling stories and writing laws. Gods aren't physical realities. Rather, they are cultural artifacts we created by inventing myths and writing scriptures. Words matter. Translations matter. The art of translation, requires a deep understanding of the context, the culture, the history, and the stories out of which the words have emerged, and require an intimate empathy with the source material, and the source of the material. It takes skill, sensitivity, and imagination to transmit a universe of meaning behind every word or phrase that we use. It just occurs to me, on my very first solitary retreat, I was by the sea and I hadn't spoken to anybody for 2 or 3 weeks. And I went for a walk in the evening. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, a small cliff in Dorset, looking at the sea. And I was just, as you are on a solitary retreat, just very kind of involved in my own inner universe. The sea was there, but my mind, my head, my thinking was just all me in my world. And then this voice suddenly said, "It's a bloody shame, isn't it?" And it was a man standing nearby who was pointing down to the rubbish that somebody had dumped over the cliff. But even those words, out of this moment on a solitary retreat, just made me think, how weird. There's this whole universe going on in there, and he's got a whole universe going on there. And we just use these little sounds to try and make some kind of contact, even if it's about the rubbish. But the mystery of communication just struck me with some kind of fascinating clarity in that moment, in this very, very humdrum situation. But it was his attempt through those words to put his universe in touch with mine. And in a way, words deserve to be respected. If this applies to words, imagine the scale of the project when it comes to translating, introducing an entire spiritual tradition from one culture, where it's home culture, if you like, in a very different world, a very different continent, a very different historical period, into a new one. That's the challenge that was facing Sangharakshita when, in 1966, he decided to stay in the UK and develop a new kind of Buddhist movement. And I say kind of Buddhist movement, not just a new Buddhist movement, but an entirely new kind of Buddhist movement. He was well aware of the scope and the scale of the project. I don't think he had any illusions. It wasn't something he did lightly or casually. I mean, Buddhism, the Buddha Dharma, goes back 2,500 years. It was born in another world, effectively a very, very different culture to ours. In a way, its religious principles, its goal, its purpose, its practice of the spiritual life was quite alien to our cultural principles and practices and assumptions about the religious life. Buddhism has no God, and therefore it has no concept of salvation or redemption, thanks to God, and therefore it has a totally different understanding and relationship with ethics and the idea of sin. And yet, even though it has no God, it's not a secular vision either. Just after he was enlightened, 7 or 8 weeks according to the tradition after he was enlightened, the Buddha was walking from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath, and he came across a man, and this man he met just on this track saw the Buddha, the newly awakened Buddha, and there was something special. He knew there was something different, something special about this man. He seemed to glow. So according to the accounts, he said, "Are you a deva? Are you a Gandharva? Are you a yaksha? Are you a spirit? Are you a god? Are you a goblin?" And the Buddha said, those psychological conditionings, according to which you could call me a yaksha, a deva, a gandharva, are exhausted in them. They no longer apply. Therefore, you must call me a Buddha, an awakened one. It was the only way to communicate to this man that he was of a different order, an order that transcended the ordinary human, even though he was born a human. Whatever it was that had happened to him in this awakening sort of took him totally out of any categories, any ordinary, if you like, secular categories, or even mundane religious categories that we might want to work with. So here's his Buddhism. It's something quite different. It has a transcendental goal, a transcendental spirit running through it, and yet something quite different to our Western Judeo-Christian heritage. In 1982, just to jump ahead for a moment, I spent a couple of days with Dado Rinpoche, one of Bante's teachers and his closest friend, through about 10 years. And we talked for about 12 hours during those 2 days. And at one point, because at that time, 1982, quite a few Buddhist centers were establishing themselves in the West, and of course Trungpa was fairly well established in the States. I said, do you think Tibetan Buddhism is helpful in the West? Do you think, does it have a future? I can't remember my words. And he laughed. It was a kind laugh, but he said, but Tibetan Buddhism is Tibetan. For 1,000 years, we've been practicing the Dharma, living our lives, and you now cannot see the difference between our culture and the Dharma. You can't see where the Dharma ends and our culture begins, and vice versa. So the very idea in his mind that you could just transpose Tibetan Buddhism to the West, to him at least in that moment just seemed, it wasn't absurd, he wasn't being insulting, but the very idea struck him as alien. Why would you do that? He said, you've got to do what we did. That's the project you've set yourself. And he knew, that was the project that Sangharakshita had set himself. And he said, if I was a younger man, I'd love to come and help Sangharakshita. But he was, I think he was 65. He died about 10 years later. Sangharakshita hasn't been the first person to propose that the integration, the naturalization of Buddhist principles, Buddhist practice, Buddhist values into the Western world, now we have to say really the modern world, will bring about nothing less than a total cultural, spiritual, psychological renaissance of unimaginable dimensions in the arts, in the way society is organized, and so on. That's the dream. But in 1966, when Sangharakshita returned from a visit to India, just to put you in the picture, I'll say more in a moment, but just very briefly, Sangharakshita had lived in India for 20 years, was invited to visit Britain, spent some time here, went back to India and returned finally in 1966, planning to start a new movement. And it's important to realize how new even awareness on any kind of popular level Buddhism was at that time. The Light of Asia, a sort of poetic epic written by Sir Edwin Arnold, The Life of the Buddha, was published in 1879. Not very long ago, if you were born in 1925, as Sangharakshita was. The Buddhist Society, the London Buddhist Society, which was kind of the most well-known umbrella group organization promoting Buddhism here in England, was founded in 1924, the year just before Sangharakshita was born. There had been some translations. There had been travelers' tales, people who'd been to Tibet or to India had written their books, their accounts of the people they'd met, the temples they'd visited. There were 1 or 2 temples, Buddhist temples, established in the UK by immigrant monks, serving the needs of their ethnic followers. Popularly, Zen was quite well known thanks to people like Alan Watts. And the more sort of serious students would have been probably more aware of and more interested in Theravada Buddhism, the oldest school. They sort of took it on trust, by its representatives, that the Theravada wasn't just the oldest, but it was also the authentic teaching of the Buddha. But as people became aware more and more of what Buddhism was, they became aware of, say, the Tibetan schools and the Zen schools and the Chinese schools and the Indonesian schools, and all this sort of massive variety of Buddhist schools, Buddhist teachings, Buddhist practices, and some of them so different that you couldn't even easily see how they had anything in common, anything like a single religious impulse in common. So in a lot of people's eyes, Buddhism was an exotic, contradictory, and confusing mishmash, to which some people felt a little bit of allegiance in quite a surprisingly partisan way. This being the case, Sangharakshita, well, you can, I won't jump ahead. This being the case, you could argue that most people in the West were not psychologically or culturally open to receiving Buddhism, because, again, as a religion, it was totally different, totally alien to our Judeo-Christian heritage, and it looked like a kind of mess. It made me think of, I don't know if this is an apocryphal story, but the saying is that when Cortez or whoever it was landed his ships somewhere off the coast of South America, the locals who were looking out to sea literally didn't see them, because they were so completely alien to the universe and the world they lived in that they couldn't their brains couldn't translate the evidence of their eyes into an idea ship. So the story is that they didn't even see them. So in some ways at that time, Westerners, we Brits, were just simply not culturally prepared to even discern Buddhism as a religion, or there were some who just held on to the idea that they did know what it was, and it was the teaching of this particular school. What people didn't see was any unity between those different schools and those different approaches. Now, I'll read you something by a contemporary writer. Oh, yes. Just bear with me and bear with the language. But this is how one Western commentator saw the situation at that time. It's part of a longer article, but just see if you can get the gist. Those doctrines which an Occidental mentality found difficult of comprehension were precisely those in which the Pali Canon are only mentioned or touched upon very lightly, without the profound investigation, the thorough grasp of the later protagonists in the history of Buddhist thought, such as Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, Asanga, etc. Thus, we were given, here in the West, in England, only that which we could assimilate without having to reorganize the processes of our cognition, while the equally valuable doctrines, which were in later ages developed or logically expatiated from primitive Buddhism by the lucid and profound minds above mentioned, we either did not know or knowing did not appreciate. You might think that that paragraph was written by a doddering, fusty old professor between cups of Horlicks. They weren't. They were written by an 18-year-old from Tooting. The article, The Unity of Buddhism, appeared in The Middle Way, or what the Buddhist Society's magazine was called at that time. It was an audacious article. It was, a corrective of the way, because the Middle Way, that magazine, had a worldwide readership, throughout Britain, but it was one of the first established Buddhist organizations anywhere addressing the modern world. So that article from this 18-year-old army conscript in, I think, 1941, was an astonishing thing, astonishingly audacious, brave, and quite a clarion call. You can also see it through those fusty old words. It's a manifesto, it's a promise. This was the first published article, the first time Sangharakshita ascended a platform and addressed the Buddhist world, and indeed the entire world. Ultimately, it was if you like, a promise that one day something like Triratna would emerge, that one day people like us would be in this room trying to discover and finding that it is possible to discover and assimilate and practice Buddhism. His journey, this 18-year-old's journey, had started earlier. Just have a sip. He'd already lived quite a life. And very briefly, just a few waymarks. At the age of 8, he was misdiagnosed with a heart condition, but as a result, spent 2 years in bed, being told not to move. He developed a very high degree of physical self-awareness, which he never lost. He became an avid reader, anything his father could find for him in second-hand shops, libraries, his own library. The neighbor lent a 62 episode in children's encyclopedia, which he absolutely devoured many times, and through that learned history, philosophy, religion. I mean, having looked at some of the material, for children, it was pretty mature stuff. So this boy, Dennis, devoured this stuff and devoured anything he could read. So by the time he left his bed 2 years later, he not only had to learn to walk again, but he could read at a phenomenal speed. For the rest of his life, he read 2-3 books a week. Had an extraordinary breadth and depth of knowledge. And when he went back to school, had to be put 2 years ahead of other people in his age group. The only thing that getting in the way of that going further was that the war broke out. The home he lived in was bombed, and his family were just about to go in there when it happened, but luckily they didn't. And he was evacuated. But he had this, through the reading, through what he read, through the novels, the poetry, and this encyclopedia, just to give you a quick taste of how he describes his imagination at the time. Just very, so it's just sweet, and this is him talking about what it meant to him to be reading this encyclopedia in bed. His imagination became so vivid because there was so little stimulation of any other kind. He said that the heroes of ancient and modern tragedy trod my bedside rug for their stage. Perseus slew Medusa, the Gorgon. Hercules performed his 12 labors, and Jason went in search of the golden fleece in my sight. The cross on which Christ was crucified, the tree beneath which the Buddha attained enlightenment, had their roots in the floor of my bedroom. The body was forgotten, and my imagination, now possessed of infinite riches in a little room, rejoiced in the freedom of all the heavens of the spirit. That inner life, that powerful imagination manifested a little bit later on, once he was out and about, in having these sort of, if you like, mystical intimations. Just one of which I'll mention. He writes about others. Just walking along the road in Tooting, it just occurs to him how weird it is, how absurd it is that his consciousness is just lodged in his body. Why, he wondered, can't I just be inside that person's body or that person's body? Why does it have to be limited? in this way. And as he had those thoughts, he sort of felt his consciousness starting to expand, as if allowed to, if it wasn't sort of inhibited, it might be possible to inhabit all these other people's minds, or for them to inhabit his. And then, the events that he talks about most often, and where a lot of people would kind of place the beginning of his real journey, was when he read Madame Blavatsky's book, Isis Unveiled, and realized finally, categorically, and in a way that seems to have really liberated him, that he wasn't a Christian and never had been. I mean, he'd been a member of the Boys' Brigade, which had kind of religious teachings and things, and he hadn't minded. He'd been quite moved by the Bible, which I don't know how many times he read that. But he realized, it was with a shock of liberation that he didn't believe it. And then very soon afterwards, he came across the Diamond Sutra. And I don't know if any of you have seen or tried to read the Diamond Sutra. I mean, he was 16 and he picks up the Diamond Sutra and he reads it and has this extraordinary experience, a kind of a comprehensive momentary vision. I asked Paramartha, who was his closest friend for the last 30 years of his life, did he ever actually talk about the content of that vision, that experience? And Paramartha realized, no, he didn't. It wasn't like that. He said it was just like, well, it was as if like a flash of lightning. Suddenly everything was clear. That's as far as Sangharakshita would go, but he knew that he was a Buddhist. I think the fact that it was the Diamond Sutra that had inspired this flash, whether it was momentary or minutes, I don't know. I think he knew intuitively, immediately that any religious tradition that could have given birth to something like those lines he just read in the Diamond Sutra, it understands the core. He felt he'd touched the core, and that text had done it, and that meant these were his people. This was his world. You can wonder, 16-year-olds do have powerful intuitive experiences, and it's not impossible that there are a few people in this room who've had an experience like Sangharakshita's. It's not as if we have to think, it was like the Buddha's enlightenment, or it was this deep or that deep. I think two things. Firstly, there was, irrespective of whatever happened in the rest of his life, an absolute fidelity to Buddhism. And he once said to me, in his 40s, he was in his 50s, he just said, none of my scholarship, none of my practice of meditation, none of my involvement in the Buddhist world, none of the Buddhists I've met have ever led me to question the validity of that initial experience. He laughed after saying, and he said, actually, that's quite a claim to make, isn't it? But in a way, he wasn't necessarily claiming that it was ultimate, absolute. He wasn't claiming he'd been enlightened ever since. But what he did do ever since, to his dying day, was dedicate his life to it. And if you want a measure of the depth or the effect of an experience like that, well, you just have to look at what a person does with the rest of his life. And I never saw, in the time I lived with him, I never saw his sense of purpose or his sense of urgency decline. It's what his life was about from then on. Paradoxically, I have to immediately say that when the army, the wartime army, took him to India, he hardly found any Buddhists. Instead, he spent for a year or more a lot of his time with Hindu swamis, helping them, doing quite a lot of administrative work in their temples, even writing articles for their magazines, in which he kind of seemed to be very much, caught up in the non-dual world of the Hindu mystics that he was engaging with in that world. But even though he was doing that, and even though much later he definitely saw through, some aspects of their teachings and philosophy, even throughout all that time. He knew he was a Buddhist. The trouble is, when he did meet Buddhists, something else he admitted to me many years ago, he said, if anything nearly put me off Buddhism, it was the people I met. It was the Buddhists I met. There was, he would either encounter puffed up bhikkhus, big monks, just accepting food and gifts from the laity without giving much back, very full of themselves. He would hear stories of similar things happening to entire communities, almost being conned into taking on a bhikkhu, a monk from Sri Lanka, and finding that they more or less just lived a life of self-indulgence. Sangharakshita kept bumping into stories like this. He did meet a handful of very sincere and impressive Buddhists along the way, but his overriding experience for quite a while was disillusionment with the people, but never with Buddhism, never with the Buddha Dharma. He and a friend wandered, there's quite a story here, but they wandered for a year or two around India from the south up to the north, mainly meeting Hindus and occasionally Buddhists. But eventually, yes, Sangharakshita fulfilled a dream, a wish, to be ordained as a Buddhist monk. Now, for him, when he was ordained by a Burmese monk, a very senior Burmese monk in Kusinara, and then he had his higher ordination a year or so later in Sarnath, he realized he had thought of his ordination as being a moment where his love for the Dharma, his connection to the Buddha, was being witnessed and acknowledged by other Buddhists. He never really thought of himself as joining their club, their Nikaya, to use a technical term. And in a way, nor did they. They kind of recognized that he was doing his thing in his way. But he spent time with them. He spent many profitable months with a fairly senior monk. Before, at that senior monk's suggestion, he moved to Kalimpong, a town on the Indian, Bhutanese, Sikkimese, Tibetan border. He spent 14 years there in Kalimpong, living in an entirely Tibetan, Nepali context with Tibetan, Nepali teachers. It was a very rich time, a very, if you like, a very unorthodox time. He wore the robes, he wore the sort of the ochre robes of his Theravada ordination, but most of his connections, most of his friends, most of his teachers were Tibetans. But all the time, whatever the teaching was, whether it was coming from the Tibetan teachers or from the older Pali texts that he continued to read and study, all the time he would ask, what does this teaching have to do with the actual living of the spiritual life? His reference point was, if you like, the core. What's this got to say to me now? What's the teaching in this? And with that as his core, and if you like, that deep intuitive vision experience that he'd had as his reference point, he was able to see that there was a unity in all the teachings and traditions from these different worlds, the Tibetan world, the Pali world. And it was on that basis of recognizing that he wrote his, what he still, I think, thought of as his masterwork, A Survey of Buddhism, which I know some of you will have read. And also another book, less read in our community, The Eternal Legacy. But in those books, and particularly in the book, A Survey of Buddhism, he outlined in some detail, not just the teachings of the different schools and the whole Buddhist heritage, but the interconnection, the relevance of these schools to the spiritual journey that we all take. There was nothing lightweight about his project. He wasn't merely dipping here, dipping there, setting up some kind of eccentric little school of his own. He started his own tiny but notable little monastery which was the Triyanavadana Vihara, the monastery of the three ways. It was, again, another assertion, another clarion call. What he was about was the whole tradition, not just one sub-school or even one major thread of it, but he wanted to bring the world's attention to the unity at the heart of the whole tradition. It was notable, not least because the Dalai Lama came along and dedicated it at its opening, even though it was tiny, this, you could say tiny, almost insignificant place in a small town on the edge of the Himalayas. You could argue that Sangharakshita was the first modern Buddhist. He was the first person to really recognize that we in the modern world are not just waiting for some monk to wander through our village, stay for a few days, teach a bit of Buddhism and move on. We have access. And even back then, in the 50s and 60s, the world had access to the whole thing. As more books got published, more books got translated, more teachers started to travel around. Sangharakshita was really the first person to respond to the fact that this huge, seemingly confusing mass of teachings and people were coming our way. And as I say, using his experience, his understanding, his scholarship, if you like, as the reference and the key. He tried to sort of explain how all the traditions are, in a way, what in Buddhist terms we call skillful means. They were, for their society in their time, responses to the cultural needs, the psychological needs of the people in those places. But when you put them together, they add up, their different emphases, their different characters. They add up to this amazing menu for the individual to look at, to maybe make some use of. Because those different traditions, Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Pali Buddhism, the Theravada, kind of have their own emphases, and at different times in our lives might be of use. Not all the time, but maybe there's a way of working with the tradition, seeing it in terms of the developing, maturing needs of a practicing Buddhist. He wasn't suggesting that everyone should practice everything, but in principle, what he did was track the organic development of Buddhism against the organic development of a practicing Buddhist. In a way, it was a stroke of genius. And what he was saying, by extension, was there was no reason why a contemporary Buddhist shouldn't take advantage, intelligent, selective advantage, of the entire tradition in order to feed and nourish the aspects of their developing spiritual journey. I've said, although he was ordained by a Burmese Theravada monk, he was never anyone's idea of an off-the-peg Buddhist monk. He never followed any one orthodoxy. If anything, he was very critical of the whole subject of Buddhist orthodoxy. And asked again and again, what does it mean, though, to be a Buddhist? What does it mean to live a Buddhist life? What does it mean for me now? So he became known. He published magazines. He contributed to other magazines. He also, just to mention, became associated with the movement of mass conversion of Dalit, so-called untouchable Hindus, to Buddhism in the 1950s, and our community is still very much involved in that work. So as his fame sort of spread in a gentle way around the Buddhist world, and while in England, a conflict had arisen between the followers of the Zen schools mainly and those followers of the Theravada schools, the Buddhist Society and the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara. Christmas Humphreys, the sort of doyen of the British Buddhist scene, invited Sangharakshita to visit England to see whether, as the senior-most Buddhist monk, he could do something to bring the sides together. At that time, as I've said, there was very little Buddhism of any kind. The Hampstead Buddhist Vihara was fairly rigidly, triumphalistically Theravadin, with all the associated problems that Sangharakshita had seen out east. And in a way, how to say this politely, the Buddhist society seemed to be disappearing into its own void as in its dealings with Zen. So he took this in and he started to have his thoughts. But I have to mention, and I mention it briefly, something happened. He was living as a monk in this Hampstead Vihara monastery with 4 or 5, 6 other monks with regular classes, meditation, talks. He was giving talks. Somebody came to a talk, a young man about in his 30s. At that time, Sangharakshita was just into his 40s. A young man who was not interested in Buddhism particularly, but who had had a very powerful experience of the clear white light. That's how he put it. He'd done a bit of reading, and that's the language he used. And this man, Terry, and Sangharakshita developed a friendship. In a way, after these 20 years in India, this friendship with Terry, someone who didn't particularly honor Sangharakshita as a monk, didn't know much about Buddhism, but something happened, whether it was the recognition that they'd both had, this kind of experience and could talk in that language together, whether it was because Terry was struggling with sort of various psychological problems, particularly associated with his marriage. And Sangharakshita, I don't think, was wrestling with a problem, but Sangharakshita had known since he was 14 that he was gay, had never done anything about it, but probably, in this friendship with Terry, I don't know what ground they covered. To which to this day, I could have had these thoughts and had tested them with Sangharakshita, but a friendship developed between them, which was never sexual. Terry was very definitely a confirmed ladies' man. But whether it was about this clear white light, or about Terry's recurring depression, or maybe, sitting in this camper van that Terry owned into the early morning, even though Sangharakshita was maybe leading a retreat for the Buddhist Society, they just talked and talked and talked. Sangharakshita got to, or Dennis, as Terry would call him. Terry was, the younger man. Terry called Sangharakshita Dennis. But, Sangharakshita got used to not wearing his robes when he was with Terry. They went shopping and bought him, Sangharakshita, a jacket. He just started to realize that he didn't have to carry on playing that sort of monk role, that, he could still be who he was, but maybe he could allow himself the freedom, to just discover who he was in a new context, in a new way. He and Christmas Humphreys discussed the idea of Sangharakshita starting a new movement because these ideas were beginning to bubble up. He was giving talks to the Buddhist Society and the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara about traditional Buddhism, but also, for example, giving talks on this model he developed of the higher evolution. So he was beginning to sort of have ideas and thoughts of ways of communicating Buddhism and living quite experimentally for him in new ways. Trouble is, or maybe the great benefit to us is that on these Buddhist Society summer schools and events, people saw Bhante and Terry going off together, walking deep in conversation, deep in thought, disappearing for hours on end. Sangharakshita spending, the night sometimes in Terry's flat rather than at the Vihara. And basically, when he went back to India to just say goodbye to his friends, because he had decided at least to stay in the UK, he got a letter saying, thanks to your extracurricular activities, nothing was ever said in words. You will not be welcome. We won't be supporting you. And they even gave him a formula of words he could use if he wanted to resign and do the noble thing. Sangharakshita's response was, I'm morally free. I can now start my own movement. my own Sangha, my own spiritual community, and I can develop my thinking and my idea of what that would be, untrammeled by the expectations of the Buddhist Society or the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara. He admitted in one of his lectures during that sort of period of staying as a visitor, he admitted in a talk given in London that in his survey, having travelled around the country meeting local Buddhist groups, that there were possibly 30 people in the country who were in any serious way trying to practice the Dharma, practice Buddhism. Nevertheless, in the same talk, he talked to his audience of maybe 20, 30 people. So some of those people might have been among the more serious Buddhists, but he challenged them to go out and find out and think about and look for the links between English, Western culture and the Dharma. Already he was thinking, how are we going to naturalize the Dharma? Where are the threads of connection? Who's already been working in that, working that furrow? Maybe not in Buddhist language, but in a language that's congenial to Buddhism. I find it fascinating. It's such a small, tiny little group. And yet he's saying, we've got a project. That's what we need to do. He was confronted now with this vast canvas, limitless. I mean, just for a moment, just try and imagine what it must have been like to be in his head. There were by then, around 1966, 67, Trungpa and Akong had set up Samiling, and Trungpa had gone on to America. Manjushri Institute just a few years later, Throstle Hole a few years later, Sumedo maybe 10, 15 years later. It was beginning to happen, but what was happening was that teachers associated with a particular lineage, in most cases, were coming to establish their sort of native, their either native or their, as Westerners, that little branch of Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism that they'd learned out east. No one was trying to do what Sangharakshita was doing. Sangharakshita, I think, as I say, he was not unreflective. He was anything but unreflective. He would have known that that meant he had to do it all. He had to find ways of communicating to the Western world the very goal of Buddhism, something ineffable, something you can't even talk about, but how he had to find ways of talking about it. Had to devise ways of practicing, choosing which practices to teach, in what order, to who, and when. Which scriptures should he introduce to the West? They were all there, they were all available, but which one should he single out and sort of aim his followers at? Albeit from different schools, but could he locate those teachings from all those traditions that were particularly useful, particularly relevant, particularly stimulating? And always when introducing texts, and if any of you have listened to or read his lectures, very often will begin his introduction of a theme from one of the scriptures by going in some detail into the etymology of the sort of the core words in the teaching, because he really understood that words matter at every level. So it's kind of interesting to watch him at work in his lectures. So often they'll begin with some little, it might feel like a diversion to some, but for him it was extremely important that we know what, let's just get clear before we go any further, what are we talking about? How do you approach as a Buddhist, but living in a post-Christian culture, how do you address ethics? It's a very important booklet he wrote, Buddhism and Blasphemy. If you've never come across it, it has been incorporated into the complete works, but get your hands on a copy of Buddhism and Blasphemy. He wrote it in response to the trial of the publishers and of a magazine called Gay News, which had written a sort of seemingly pornographic take on the crucifixion. And the publishers of the magazine were successfully prosecuted for blasphemy, which most people thought wasn't even a law anymore. But in response to it, Sangharakshita grabbed the opportunity to talk about the extent to which, even if you don't think you're a Christian, even if you think you've rejected it, he wasn't trying to get at Christians and telling them to reject it, but if you think you've rejected Christianity, for example, to become a Buddhist, you probably have no idea what is still lurking in your consciousness when you think about teachers, when you think about enlightenment, when you think about dukkha, when you think about confession. All these things are totally different in the Buddhist context. And so, for example, by writing this sort of essay, giving talks, he just found ways of introducing us to a Buddhist world, the Buddhist story, the Buddhist myths. It could have been an eclectic mix, but Sangharakshita preferred to use the term critical ecumenicism, an open embrace of the whole tradition, but intelligent, critical, thoughtful. He had to develop new models, new metaphors, the higher evolution of man, the heroic ideal, the true individual. He preferred to use the language of growth and development rather than the more traditional languages of nibbana, of extinction, of cessation. He was, in other words, a translator, a transmitter, a curator. And all the time, while doing all that, and as people came towards him and started to be interested and hang around with him, he also had to think, and what do I do about my followers? What kind of a world am I going to create? Is it going to be monks and lay people? Or what? And develop this idea of the possibility of an order that was neither monastic nor lay. Could give a whole series of talks on that theme and what we did with it, for better and worse. But all the time he was thinking, reflecting, looking at us, if you like, collaborating with us as we 20-year-olds, most of us, just listened to him, went on retreat with him, and we experimented just as he was experimenting. But in a way, the question underlying it all was, how do we support each other, inspire each other, create a world of spiritual friendship that we can all be inspired by and moved along with? And how do we engage our depths and our imagination in the spiritual life? There's so much of Western Buddhism that he'd seen had been espoused by people who looked to Buddhism as a religion free of religious claptrap, religious mumbo-jumbo, idol worship and all that. And it's true, it is free of religious claptrap and idol worship, but it has an extremely prolific tradition of what you could call, if you use Jungian language, of the use of active imagination in finding ways of relating as directly and meaningfully as you can with the ideal in a non-conceptual but truly motivating way. All this had to be not just invented, often just picked out of the tradition and communicated and put into a way that might work. As I say, it was a sort of collaboration about which, I could say much more. And in fact, as Jayagupta kindly mentioned, I have written a book about all this. So if you're interested in what happened, read the book. The background, of course, and I think the essential background to what was going on was his own willingness to experiment personally. The small situation I was in with him, he was talking about on the theme of commitment. Someone had just given a short talk in a speaker's class about commitment. Well, it was me. But in a way, that's a bit irrelevant. But after I'd spoken, he was chairing the evening. He said, talking about commitment, he said, the forces and factors at work in my character and personality were so powerful and sometimes so self-contradictory, particularly between the dreamer, the poet, and the ascetic monk. They were so powerful that if I hadn't discovered something as profound as worthy of my devotion as the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, then I think those forces would have pulled me apart. I honestly believe I would have gone mad. It's quite a thing to say. And, something that working in the West allowed him to do, or at least he decided to allow himself to do, was, apart from growing his hair and not wearing his robes all the time, he allowed himself for the first time in his life to have a sex life. Now, in that process, imagine someone who's never been socialized in any normal way, let alone in the sexual arena. It was a very important drive in him. It was a very important sort of aspect of his life to just explore that side of himself, enjoy that side of himself. But, tests have shown, time has shown, along the way, he made mistakes. I think he acted naively. Paramartha, that friend who I mentioned a moment ago, just says, well, it's like he poured concrete over that whole side of himself for 30 years. How is it possible he wouldn't have made mistakes? But of course, he was in this increasingly prominent role in our movement. It's left us with a very complicated legacy. There's so many stories in there to go into, but there's just one I want to tell. I think I just have to mention this, but I want to mention it. This is neither an excuse nor a justification, because there's no question harm is harm. But just to go back to our theme, when the Buddhist society expelled him, as it were, from their world, on the grounds of a misperception of his friendship with Terry as a gay relationship, he then nevertheless decided when he came back to allow himself to have a sexual life. And I can't remember my words, but it was something like, what possessed you, given the gossip, given the stories, given the rejection? How come you allowed yourself? And he gave two answers in quick succession. The first one was a little bit kind of waspish and personal, was, well, I decided I might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. But then the second answer was, but then I could have done that, but of course we'd have an entirely different order and movement. And by that he didn't just mean that if he had stayed celibate, he would have established a traditional world of monks and lay people. What he meant, what I take him to have meant, was it would have been such a denial of his fundamentally audacious, wild, untamed character that he just couldn't have been effective at the depth he needed to be to pull off the project and to create the kind of movement that we've got. So for better, for worse, and a lot of effort's gone into tracking down, the harm done, the people who've been hurt. It's initiated a whole world of safeguarding within Triratna. But, I find it interesting to ponder that remark of his. Had he decided to, as it were, be the good monk, well, what kind of a movement would we have? How many of us would have been attracted to it? My honest answer is I don't think I would have been. And if he'd been heterosexual, he would have been a rival, and that would have been a different problem. But we won't go there. And for 15 years, he just, in a way, whether it was in his reading or his thinking, and Paramartha says that Sangharakshita could sit in his chair for hours without moving, just turning a point over or a question over in his mind. And as he watched us, guided us, thought about us and what we were doing, what we were needing, the movement gradually emerged. When I first met Sangharakshita in November 1970, I went to one of his lectures in London. There were about 30 people in the room. Already those first 12 order members, most of them were no longer very actively involved. It was tiny. And yet, he still took this huge risk with no plan of how he was going to be supported, who would like it, who'd respond. what they'd think of him as being a monk and yet somehow having sexual partners. He just gave it his all. And as I say, never for one moment being around him did you think of him as a sort of a libertine or someone whose mind was preoccupied with anything but the Dharma. The amount of times living with him, I would suggest something he might be interested in, a film he might be interested in seeing, something he might be interested in doing. His response would be, well, I'd like to, but there's no time. It's odd to say, I lived with him in 2 different communities, probably for 6 years. I honestly never saw him waste a moment. But, along the way, there were successes and failures. We've learned from some of them. We'll no doubt make new ones. But we're now a worldwide movement with thousands of people, developing institutions. We live in very different times, very different society, very different economy, very different Buddhist world around us. But Triratna is still here. It's still unique. It's still distinctive. It has its own very particular take on Buddhist doctrine, Buddhist methods, and it has a very special atmosphere. And having, in the last 30 years, done a lot of travel to America, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, you can walk into any centre and you can feel at home and meet that same atmosphere of warmth, openness, transparency, and friendship. And at the heart of it all is Sangharakshita's sense of purpose and his experiment, his willingness to explore. That is the DNA of our movement. In time, we will evolve more teachers of our own, maybe the occasional spiritual genius. But for a long time yet, we'll owe a debt to the work Sangharakshita began, the stories he told, the world that he translated into existence. And it's now up to us to see it into whatever comes next.